Yeah,
your screen, this one. Okay, so which screen are we sharing right now?
I think if you do full screen, we can jump to duplicate if it shows up wrong. So let's
this one. All right, Jim, can you see the screen now?
Yes, the slides show up nicely now.
Okay, awesome. All right, awesome. All right, we still have 2 minutes. Awesome. Let's go.
I get good turnout when I make my students come. Maybe we can adapt that for future engineering seminar in our series. Oh, I'm glad you showed it. I'm glad you responded to it. Yeah, the Governor Thompson provided funds to do so, and I hope the presentation's of interest to you. I'll pre-apologize if any of you have sleepless nights after it's all said and done. What's it? We just watched this for that. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of the thing that's been on my mind for 2 years. As you know, it's getting more.
All right, we have more room over that side. If someone can squeeze over that side.
My students, make sure you sign up.
We have one paper going around. It will come to you at some point. Yeah, it will come to you at some point. Okay, well, it's 5 o'clock. I think this, there we go. Oh, nope. It's green. Okay, so I think it's fine now. Okay, well, 5 o'clock, I'll get started. Wow, it's a big house. Welcome, everybody. My name is Danny Xiao. Sorry, my shirt has a lot of concrete on it because we just came back from concrete lab today. Welcome. This is our first engineering seminar series for this semester. Very brief introduction of the engineering seminar series. It's hosted by UW-Platteville College of Engineering, Math and EMS, Engineering, Mathematics, and Science. And then we use EMS. That's why I even couldn't remember the full name. It's free to and open to the public. And then the presentation is to showcase how engineering is done. We want to show you the behind the scene, how the project is done, and then how we can contribute to make the world a better place. Today we are very honored to have Dr. Tom Zolper from mechanical engineering from UW-Platteville to give us a presentation on energy. So we all know how important energy is, and then we're very excited for the topic. Dr. Zolper's research interests are in the areas of polymer biology, multi-phase flow, and energy systems. His expertise includes predictive polymer biology on tribological interfaces and mass diffusion in two-phase flows. That's very hard to read. I cannot imagine how you do the research on that. So awesome. Recently, his research has addressed energy security, founded by Thompson Center for Public Leadership, and the rheology of dairy products, funded by Wisconsin Dairy Innovation Hub. Dr. Zolper earned his mechanical engineering from Northwestern University and his Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Northern Illinois University. Prior to joining UW-Platteville, he worked in the automotive industry as a design and quality engineer. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Zolper.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao. I'm humbled by the crowd that turned out for this. I want to start off by thanking the Governor Tommy Thompson Center for Public Leadership for funding this research. It was a tremendous help. I applied for it back in, I think, summer of 21, and this is really the culmination of all of the results. So The title, obviously, the Wisconsin strategy refers to the Wisconsin idea, an obvious play on words, but when you're writing out grant applications, you got to come up with clever titles to kind of hopefully get the funding. So hopefully this is of interest to you and not too unnerving. The Thompson Center sent out a solicitation for proposals for addressing public emergencies. It was in response to the COVID pandemic, but I kind of, as a professor of energy systems design and various energy courses, had on my mind the concerns that you might read about in the news sometimes about energy security. And the title, Independent or Infrastructure Independence, was referring, at least in my mind at the time, to energy sector. But there's actually 16 sectors, so to speak, of critical infrastructure in the United States, and inherently kind of begins to encompass many of them, I guess you could say. So the focus is on securing the energy sector. But there's two sectors that are closely tied to that, the information technology sector and the communication sector, because without information going back and forth showing, say, the public demand and providing utility supply, one can't really maintain the energy sector and keep the lights on, keep the heat on, and all of that we have. But the energy sector is kind of the linchpin, you could say, of many of the other infrastructure sectors. And if that or its, I guess, cohorts, communication and information sector, were to fall, one of the three would cause the other two to go down. And that would kind of quickly trigger a cascade of failures, I guess you could say. And despite how unrealistic it might seem, it turns out there are several potential failure modes for the energy sector. So it happened in spring of 2021 when I was kind of formulating the idea that the Texas power grid failed due to some ice storms that the system itself wasn't really designed for. And then within a few months, the Colonial Pipeline was hacked and took down a lot of the transportation infrastructure on the East Coast. And so those worked very well, I guess you could say, for the reviewers of the proposal for a project that you could say was focused on energy security for the state of Wisconsin. But in the back of my mind, I had a concern that I had read about some 10 years ago or so concerning the use of electromagnetic pulses on an energy infrastructure, electric infrastructure in particular. But it is, I said, would have a cascading effect on neighboring or adjacent infrastructure as well. Now, what happened at this time, I was reading ASME magazine, a publication sent out from the Society of Mechanical Engineers, and they had done, as you can see, a special report on electrical grid resilience pertaining exactly to the topic that I was applying for. And one of the excerpts in this publication mentioned the problems that could arise, I guess you could say, with electromagnetic interference. They're referred to as low frequency but high impact events because despite the thought, at least, that they might not ever occur or might only occur every 100 years or so, the impact they could have could really cause the entire United States electric grid to collapse in a matter of seconds. So you can see the quote here. They mentioned the sun has the ability to cause disruption to the power system. Happens fairly frequently. Some of you might have heard of the Carrington event back in the 1850s or 60s or so. Sent northern lights all the way down to Columbia because it supercharged the electromagnetic atmosphere of the Earth. But a more pressing concern, I guess you could say, is that a rogue nation could detonate a nuclear device in the United States and take down portions of the grid. Can anyone think of a rogue nation that might try such a thing? Starts with an R. Yeah, so it turns out we're kind of beholden to the whims of a few powerful people in the world, some of whom have the ability to really disrupt our daily comforts and all that. And one happens to be Vladimir Putin, who's got an arsenal of ballistic and cruise missiles, kind of shown in the figure here. And what this figure illustrates, you can see it comes from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. What it illustrates is kind of the goals and ambitions, you could say, of those who develop these nuclear products, many of whom are engineers, by the way. And some of the trajectories shown here are actually satellite trajectories. And the notion is that if they could place a properly designed nuclear weapon inside a satellite, essentially they'd have this threat that continuously circles the Earth, and every time it passes over the United States, it would present the risk that, maybe Putin's having a bad day, decides to push that actuator. Now, he's not alone, of course, in this. There's also our dictator friend from North Korea who's aspiring to the exact same thing, albeit with much less of a budget. So in the mid-2010s or so, there was a lot of controversy that he had managed to get a missile up into orbit, and it still actually continually traverses across the United States. So what essentially both figures have recognized is that there's a type of super weapon that can be used with a single instance and cause a really catastrophic disruption of the energy systems of any given nation. It happens, the legacy of the Cold War means that the United States is one of the target nations for these two individuals. So the threats posed by Russia and North Korea led to the formation of what's referred to as the EMP Commission. It's a group of experts, you'll see in a moment, who had several testimonies before the U.S. Congress. This is an excerpt of some of the transcripts from their 2015 testimony, May 13th. On the panel of witnesses are Dr. George Baker, professor of James Madison University, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, director on Task Force National and Homeland Security, and then Mike Caruso. And I encourage you to read these transcripts, at least if you like insomnia or something. Essentially, they're kind of chilling outlines of kind of the problems that could arise if ever Kim Jong-un or Vladimir Putin put into effect some of the weapons that they've been developing. So one of the experts points out that in the midst of the North Korea crisis, they orbited a satellite over the South Pole that passed over the territory of the United States on the optimum trajectory and altitude to evade our national missile defenses, which are all focused on the Northern Hemisphere, because prior to that, they used to worry about a ballistic missile being sent from the Soviet Union over the North Pole. Since that time, they've developed rocketry to allow them to put satellites into space and all of that. But he points out that if it had an EMP over it, it could have affected all 48 contiguous United States that would have had catastrophic consequences. Going on to say, this is a 60, 80-page document, but he points out that he's been to some of the EMP meetings in Britain where they're actually protecting their grid, but the rule of thumb is that it's 3 days till total anarchy. Some of you might have heard of the blackout in New York City that occurred in the 1970s, lasted for 26 hours, and it was total anarchy within 1 day, essentially. So what they are projecting here is that it would be just as bad, if not worse, really in all the major cities in the United States. And they go on to say that they're talking about almost certainly within a year, you'd lose at least half the American population. So it's a pretty dire vision, I guess you could say, of what could happen. And the Department of Homeland Security was concerned about this, and so they had run some simulations of exactly what threat had been posed. That is to say, a 300 kiloton blast located at 300 kilometers above the contiguous United States. You can see a blast, I guess, ground zero would be placed at over the state of Nebraska. And essentially the electromagnetic pulse that would emanate from such a weapon would send out three distinct signals: the so-called early time signal, intermediate time, and late time signal. The early time signal would disable all electronics, so cell phones, computers, laptops, control stations in energy systems and all of that. The second intermediate time pulse actually resembles lightning, and most of the infrastructure has been designed to handle that type of pulse. But then the third magnetohydrodynamic signal is a signal that would last of the order of a few minutes or so, and it would actually overwhelm power lines. It would induce a current in the power transmission and distribution lines, causing transformers and all that to overload and burn out. And I kind of use the analogy of the sword of Damocles. This is from an old, I think, Greco-Roman story about a king who, was talked to by one of his admirers about how great it must be to be king. And he kind of mentioned, yeah, it's nice to have the wealth and all of that, but there's always this sword hanging over you of adversaries who might want to take you out. And so the prospective satellites, some of which may actually be in orbit already, are essentially a modern sword of Damocles, where the whole United States could be regarded as Damocles. So a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, this is the abbreviation used for the type of singular superweapon that could knock down the United States electrical infrastructure and other portions of it as well, would essentially damage the controls in the generating stations, as well as any electronics used by any end-use customers, as well as overload the power lines and blow out transformers at the generator substations and all of those things. So this is kind of an excerpt of one of the, I think it was Homeland Security studies on the threats, you could say, to the electric infrastructure in the United States. You can see an electromagnetic pulse really takes the cake with direct permanent effects on generator stations, control centers, the internet, emergency services, transportation, water, basically the whole gamut of I guess, critical infrastructure. Beyond that, solar storms can have similar effects. They only emit the so-called E3 or late time pulse, but nonetheless, if a modern day Carrington event were to occur, we'd experience similar impacts as that of a electromagnetic pulse. Beyond that, physical attacks and radio frequency weapons are a lot more focused in the impact that they could have. So as a result of that testimony in 2015 to Congress by the EMP Commission, the politicians allocated billions and billions of dollars in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, in this case, IIJA abbreviation. And it's worth reading that and noting, you can even find the PDF and just do a word search, noting how many times they mention resilience in the actual Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And even here you can see $5 billion for all 50 states for these fiscal years to develop approaches to hardening and enhancing the resilience and reliability of transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. Now, they're not concerned about squirrels climbing onto a transformer and causing a short out in a very localized region. This is very much in response to the testimony of those three witnesses that presented before Congress, not only in 2015, but several instances previously. So this all kind of came around at the same time. Actually, I filed for the award prior to the approval of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. But essentially what I proposed was to enhance the resilience of the Wisconsin energy and information infrastructure against natural or man-made failures to minimize the likelihood of public emergencies. That was, as I said, the goal of the award for that year from the Governor Tommy Thompson Center. And I proposed three objectives. One is to perform an energy audit on the infrastructure, identify available supplies, as well as vulnerabilities in equipment, design, network interfaces, and all that. And then identify how failures of one system, such as energy or information or communications infrastructure, could cascade downstream and cause failures of others, such as the energy infrastructure. So the presentation, henceforth, I guess, is broken into these three main objectives, which I'll kind of repeat as we go through them. So starting with an energy audit. Anyone know what an energy audit is? I know some of my SRES students should. I won't put you on the spot though. So essentially it's an accounting of supply and demand. It's very much like an economic financial audit, just how much supply is coming in, what is the demand, do the books balance? And it takes a little understanding of some of the major terminology associated with energy systems. So on the one hand, we've got primary or resource energy, which is the energy directly harvested from energy resources, like coal in a coal train, oil from an oil well,
or natural gas, more or less from the point, from the source where it's obtained. And then we've got so-called end-use energy, which is the energy used at the point of use by customers. So the lights in this room, the gasoline we use to fill our cars, or electricity used to run television, laptop, all of those different things. Then we've also got several economic sectors, 3, commercial, industrial, and residential. You could say I refer to them as the stationary economic sectors. And then there's a 4th, 5th, and even 6th, depending on how you want to quantify them, the transportation sector. Usually you see these 4 kind of stand alone in energy like overviews. But in the case of some of the information I have, at least from the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation, they include the agricultural sector. And I put these kind of in a combined unit, I guess you could say, because they're both associated with moving vehicles, whether it's cars and trucks and trains and airplanes, or combines and other agricultural devices that make use predominantly of petroleum based energy sources. And then a 5th sector, which is necessary for a robust accounting, is the electric generating sector. Essentially, that's all the electricity power generating plants within the state, or whatever region you're considering the energy audit for. Now, I found a nice file from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory that shows the Wisconsin, really an overview of the entire Wisconsin energy infrastructure. On the one hand, we see so-called primary energy coming in on the left here, where the vast majority of it is natural gas, petroleum, and coal, adding up to something of the order of 1,400 out of 1,700 trillion BTUs. By the way, 1 BTU is more or less the energy contained in 1 wooden match. So as a state, we use 1,700 trillion matches worth of, we'll say, thermal energy over the course of the year. And you can see the petroleum goes predominantly toward the transportation infrastructure. By the way, these are so-called end use, whereas this is primary use. And then a good majority of the natural gas goes to providing home heating, especially in chilly winters in Wisconsin. And then you can see a good chunk of coal goes into electricity generation, of which about 235 trillion BTUs is needed just to keep the lights on, the refrigerators running, the computers, all of that stuff going, anything that runs on grid connected electricity within the state. Now, if for some reason or another, the communications, information, or energy infrastructure were compromised, whether it's through a solar storm or a cyber attack or even an EMP, we'd quickly lose pretty much all our fossil fuel energy sources, and it would be likely that nuclear would go out as well, simply based on the control operations of typical nuclear power plants. So what would we do? Put on a lot of sweaters and turn on the flashlights, right? Well, in a little bit, we'll kind of see some recommendations, but I'll start with just kind of a stationary energy overview. Currently, Wisconsin has 8 primarily coal-powered plants with a total nameplate capacity of around 6,000 megawatts, providing 27.8 million megawatt hours of electrical energy in its own right. We've also got a few, 25 or so, petroleum plants providing basically peaking power in the summertime. It's fairly low in nameplate capacity and fairly low in overall electricity generation. So they're not a substantial concern, but you can actually see in both these figures, these are actually the rail lines, which of course bring coal to the coal-fired power plants. And if ever any of those were, for some reason or another shut down, we'd of course lose the coal provided to those coal plants. Then we've got the 33 natural gas power plants, which have similar nameplate capacity to the coal-fired power plants and provide of the order of 20.7 million megawatt hours of electricity on an annual basis. which constitutes about 32% of the total electricity generated in the state. There's also one nuclear power plant, 1,300 megawatts, providing 10 million megawatt hours of electricity per year. You can see it's situated on Lake Michigan to provide the cooling water needed to keep it operating at its level of performance. Now, more recently, they've developed some biomass plants. I think around Wausau area, you've got a few plants that are basically burning wood chips to produce electricity. Over in these regions, there's actually a lot of anaerobic digesters with producing methane that is then combusted in gas turbines to generate electricity. But even so, the 800,000 megawatt hours only provides about 1.2% of the electricity needs in the state. It's worth pointing out, though, that Ashland, Wisconsin was the first in the nation to convert from coal to wood chips, which is one of the directions I'm proposing in trying to find in-state sustainable energy resources. Further, Wisconsin's got the fourth highest number of hydroelectric dams in the country, 58 in total, with a nameplate capacity around 500 megawatts, giving us a steady supply of around 2.5 million megawatt hours of electricity in operating at capacity factors of the order of 60 to 70%. And I should point out as well, Appleton, Wisconsin was the first in the world to install a hydroelectricity plant. I learned that back in, I think, October from two hydroelectricity experts that came to campus as invited speakers. We've also got some photovoltaic arrays. I think UW-Platteville's array is about to appear. These figures I picked up about 2 years ago or so it wasn't fully online at that time. But even so, they only provide about 0.5% of the electricity needed, actually used in the state. And then we've also got 11 wind turbine farms. I think this is the one in Lafayette County. I used to drive by that fairly often, giving 1.6 million megawatt hours, or about 2.5% of the electricity. Beyond that, if we were to kind of take a high-level view at the entire infrastructure, we can look at our three stationary sectors: commercial, residential, and industrial. You can see they use a lot of natural gas. We all like to be warm in the winter, and without that natural gas, we'd all be more or less at the same temperature as the outdoors. Same reason, similar with agriculture and transportation, the so-called moving sectors. They share pretty high use, you could say, of petroleum products for transportation. This is predominantly gasoline. For agriculture, that's predominantly diesel. And then the electric utility uses a good amount of coal to this day, substantial share of natural gas, and then some level of nuclear as well. So this is, as you can recognize, an energy audit, just kind of calculating how much energy we have and how much is needed to maintain the standard of living that I think we've all come to know and love. Beyond that, the Office of Energy Innovation right here has a lot of information. They've got a very robust Wisconsin energy statistics. I think they just released their 2022 version, but I was compiling this data before the release. But you can see the state as a whole uses about 3.7 billion gallons of petroleum products per year, which is kind of typical of most states. And its breakdown shows about 400 trillion BTUs of thermal energy is used for the transportation sector. Another 15 trillion BTUs of petroleum between diesel and gasoline is used for planting and harvesting crops in the agricultural sector. And obviously, we rely quite heavily on those. Now, a little bit later, I'll be doing a recommended energy portfolio using corn ethanol and soy biodiesel as proposed replacements for gasoline and diesel, which, as we'll see in a little bit, are in limited supply as well. But from this figure, you can see the sum of these two columns, gasoline and diesel, is about 400 trillion BTUs of thermal energy, which is a little distinct from electrical energy. So again, the Wisconsin Energy Statistics has a really nice assessment of all the in-state and out-of-state energy resources used. Here, if we look at the renewable energy column, we can see all the resource energy adds up to about 142 trillion BTUs. Meanwhile, the primary energy that's required by the state is of the order of 1,641 trillion BTUs. So this implies that we import about 11.5 times more energy than we produce in state. And that kind of presents a problem. What we have here is referred to as a Hubbert curve. I'm sure some of you have heard the phrase peak oil, right? There was a movie to that effect a few years ago. But essentially what it shows is the total calculated reserves of oil in the red right here, coal in the yellow right here, and then natural gas in the blue right here. And it also shows these data points, the triangles, circles, and squares are the records of the actual use of those three fossil fuels shown there. Now, kind of what this tells us is if we look right around our time frame, kind of the middle of these lines right here, we're a little past peak oil. This doesn't take into effect, you know, this is a 2012 paper. It doesn't show the impact of COVID or anything like that. We're a little pre-peak natural gas, and it looks like we're not even halfway through the coal reserves, but many people regard coal as dirty, so not real desirable. But this kind of tells us maybe what's not openly discussed in, you know, a lot of mainstream media is that as the supply goes down, if the demand remains the same, I think everyone with economic insight can say that the price of these fossil fuels are going to start to skyrocket in a sense. And so this is part of the incentive for a transition, I guess could say, to clean energy, just recognition that fossil fuels are going to get expensive. But even if there were no problems in the world, you know, that's going to make them expensive. But if problems were to occur, such as supply chain issues, cyber attacks like the Colonial Pipeline hack, which could have really lasted much longer, or even international sanctions, as I'm sure many of you noticed when they put sanctions on Russia, the price of natural gas in Europe spiked, and now a lot of people are deciding between warming their house or buying their food. So these are just kind of an outline of some of the concerns. And here I also show at least supply chain vulnerabilities or how it is that the infrastructure would impact various sectors of our energy infrastructure. So if coal supplies were somehow cut off, we would lose a lot of electricity generation. If natural gas supplies were to diminish sooner than anticipated, we'd have trouble heating our homes. And if petroleum supplies were cut off, like if a cyber attacker closed a valve on this pipeline here, we wouldn't really see the fossil fuel supplies that we've come to rely on at our gas stations and all of that. So, and then kind of the last one here, this actually represents the major power distribution lines throughout the state of Wisconsin, which, as I mentioned earlier, would be vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse if ever a rogue nation were to decide that's how they want to play global chess. So moving on from an energy audit, and I'll admit I took a very high level view. I've got a very large spreadsheet that accounts for all those calculations and numbers. It's just a little overwhelming to present here. So objective 2 is develop a long-term strategy to invest in energy systems and infrastructure that optimize local energy sources and enhance regional energy autonomy. In this case, some of you, I'm sure most of you are aware that there's about 4 main natural resources in Wisconsin that we can make use of. We've got hydroelectric, we've got multiple forms of biomass, and that's really the most complex of all of them. Then we've got solar, photovoltaic, and or solar thermal, and then we've got wind electric. And I'll point out my approach to optimizing the in-state resources was to maximize hydroelectric, then maximize biomass, and then backfill the remainder, the deficiencies, with solar and wind. And so I'll kind of outline the process here, and I'll briefly mention our nuclear opportunities as well. So on the one hand, that 1,700 trillion BTUs is around 480 million megawatt hours. And if we were to break that down to a per capita basis, we divide 1,600 trillion by 5.8 million people. and find something of the order of 83 million watt hours of energy is used per person per year. This is a combination of thermal energy, home heating, as well as electrical energy for charging cell phones and all of that. I wanted to check my calculations, so I converted those to joules, watt hours to joules, and then I looked at this plot, and it turns out Wisconsin is right in line with the rest of the U.S. at right around 300 billion joules per person per year. And then I was also curious what the average power use of the average citizen is, and it's right around 10,000 watts or 10 kilowatts if we were to take that energy divided by the number of seconds in a year. So currently about 8.6% of all Wisconsin energy sources are renewable energy. And the vast majority of that, you can see 70% or so, is actually wood. That's the lumber industry, the timber industry up north, burning a lot of that wood for electricity generation. And it may account for some people who use wood chips for heating their homes and all of that. Further, of that, I guess you could say 8.6%, 19% is ethanol, and we're living in the ethanol region, or at least the corn production region that leads to ethanol production. And beyond that, you can see a good chunk of the pie is hydroelectric, wind, and then a tiny little fraction of solar, at least as of 2017. I did have to choose a little bit older data because the data from Wisconsin Energy Statistics came from 2017. So things have changed in the past 6 years, but it's more or less the same. So kind of in recognition of the diminishing fossil fuel supplies and, some people's concerns over the health effects, you could say, of fossil fuels in general, Governor Evers recently issued the Executive Order 38, which advocates a transition to clean renewable power by 2050. So here you can see the goal of attaining 100% carbon-free by 2050. But I want to point out right here, $12 billion per year is sent out of state to purchase fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. By the way, there are no fossil fuels that occur naturally in Wisconsin. So we kind of start off at a disadvantage in trying to obtain energy from in-state resources. Beyond that, I want to point out that one of the goals of this, I think 2019 edict or executive order was to develop a clean energy plan based on the recognition that these fossil fuel supplies would be diminishing. So these are excerpts from the Clean Energy Plan released in spring of 2022. You can see they want to accelerate clean energy deployment, maximize energy efficiency, modernize buildings, basically make them thermally efficient because buildings are basically sieves for thermal energy. You put it in and then it just flows right out. So insulation is definitely a desirable goal there. But they also proposed two kind of main energy portfolios, one of which is predominantly wind. So this big blue section here suggests regional and local wind, and then a diminishing of coal and natural gas. So here's natural gas shrinking down to nothing by 2050, and coal shrinking down to nothing by 2035 or so. Then this figure shows a similar layout, but in this case, it's primarily solar, where all of this green here represents installed solar capacity. So I took that as kind of a guideline, and I looked at some other information, such as Princeton University had a so-called net zero carbon initiative, and they laid out several energy portfolios for different regions of the country. It happens that Wisconsin would fall into the category of low electrification, high biomass levels. And this shows a typical 24-hour span of generation and load. So this would be supply and this would be demand, showing a significant portion of energy would be supplied by sunlight, at least during the day, and a significant portion would also be provided by wind. And then these down here kind of show the summation, you could say, of the demand represented by the economic sectors we saw earlier. This is from the same Princeton University study showing the annual, or I guess a 30-year trend from 2020 to 2050, showing the growth of solar and wind. So this is very much in line with what I kind of had originally intended to take on, because we are somewhat limited in the types of renewable or locally sourced energy we can obtain. So solar and wind tend to be some pretty big contributors. Let's start off with hydropower. We already saw the 58 hydroelectric plants provide about 2.5 million megawatt hours of energy every year, all in electricity. I wanted to see if they had been saturated, that is to say maxed out, or if there was opportunity for more. So I started looking at like topographical maps, various maps of the state. And I happened to come across a very valuable document, in my mind at least, this new Stream Reach Development, Comprehensive Assessment of Hydropower Potential in the United States, conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy. And it was like the diamond in the rough that I was looking for some way to quantify it or have some official numbers to back up some calculations. So essentially what they did is divide the United States into several different subbasins. Here we see 7 and 4 straddle Wisconsin. And so we'll kind of look at those in a little greater detail now. The Great Lakes subbasin shown there, you can see covers kind of the northeastern portion of the state, and the darker the green areas means the greater the hydroelectric potential for that region. So here we see a little limited area kind of in the northeast corner. And then for the upper Mississippi region, we see a greater number of green regions, but it's really only this last leg of the Wisconsin River that offers the most potential. So looking through, I found that Wisconsin, at least in theory, has the ability to gain an additional 3.5 million megawatt hours of hydroelectric power. And at least at the time, I proceeded with the assumption that it might be realistic to attain 2.5 million megawatt hours, because not a lot of people are going to want you to dam up their river and flood their backyard. And then I later learned from 2 regional hydroelectric experts that even 2.5 million megawatt hours is a pretty tall request. So I've kept my numbers the same, but in reality, this would be somewhat formidable, I think you could say, to accomplish. So as I said, we'd max out hydroelectric and then biomass. And so now we'll move on to biomass. Biomass was really the most complex of all 4 energy categories. On the one hand, we've got the 26 biomass plants in the state, but they're not necessarily representing all the energy potential that's out there. So if you kind of look at the Wisconsin biomass distribution, you'll see the state is more or less divided into 3 regions: the so-called forestry region, the northern third of the state; the dairy ring, which I kind of treat as the middle third of the state, but it's obviously down in the southern third as well. And then we'll see a little bit the agriculture, corn, and soybean region shown as well. When I first looked at this, I found this Wisconsin Forest book, and it said 649 million dry tons of wood is, at least in theory, present in Wisconsin. And I wondered to myself how much energy could be extracted from that at a sustainable harvest rate. So I proposed something of the order of 100 years, 649 million tons over 100 years. That is to say, don't cut down anyone's beautiful oak or anything like that. But if it dies, make it into wood chips and, send it in through the coal fire power plant. In this case, going through the calculations, I found like 84.4 trillion BTUs of energy would be available at that sustainable consumption rate. If it were converted to electricity, something of the order of 7.4 million megawatt hours might be attainable through that method. But I later found a more useful reference, this Wisconsin Strategic Bioenergy Feedstock Assessment, which is a really great publication in its own right. They do a pretty robust coverage of bioenergy potential, showing 4 main categories: wood residuals, grass and corn stover, manure, and solid waste, and then several candidate pathways, simplified conversion pathways, to convert it either into transportation fuels like ethanol and biodiesel, but in this case, not from those crops, or combined heat and power. Power denotes electricity, and then heat is kind of given off in the process as well. So they propose several pathways, and the solid lines represent the more efficient pathways to pursue. And they kind of have several recommendations. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of buzz by those and kind of point out the figures that they provided in here as well. So on the one hand, we've got industrial roundwood, so-called harvest residuals, and then additional roundwood. This would be regarded as high value material, so it's not really for consideration for biomass energy. But the harvest residuals denotes like the bark and the branches and the trunks and things like that, that could, at least in theory, be turned into wood chips and burned for electricity or for thermal energy. And then further south in the state, we've got corn products. So corn stover is pretty much everything except the corn grains, which can be pelletized and burned and converted to electricity or used for heat. We've also got conservation, restoration, and prairie grasses shown in these regions here. And then, of course, dairy manure associated with the dairy ring there. So they did a good compilation, I would say, of the various resources. And they even proposed how it is that we could supply a good portion of thermal energy or electric for the northern third of the state using wood residuals, and then some combinations for corn stover and conservation, restoration, and prairie grasses shown in the lower portion of the state. And just to kind of lead into some recommendations you'll see in a little bit, things that could be considered is convert existing coal power plants to wood chip power plants whenever possible, put those offline in the summer and design enough photovoltaic and storage to cover electric needs in the summer, and then use the wood chips in the winter, and use combined heat and power, CHP, plants near hospitals, population centers whenever possible. So this is, in essence, a proposal to squeeze out as much energy, or to use energy as efficiently but sustainably as possible, to at least have backup power in the event of a public emergency, right? All in keeping with the goals of the Tommy Thompson Center. So here's the table of data from a variety of sources: roundwood, wood harvest residuals, wood, all of that. I divided it into thermal energy, and I used the metric units of megawatt hours and the US customary units of BTUs for these categories, but they're essentially just different units of the same magnitude or same numbers. And then I've hypothesized at least that this thermal energy could be converted to electric at about 30% efficiency. So these tables here, or these columns here, represent metric US customary units, which are essentially these columns multiplied by 30%. By the way, this is the energy content listed for wood products, herbaceous products, and then lowers biogas products as well. And it's worth pointing out that it looks like a maximum of 221 trillion BTUs of thermal energy could be obtained from biomass. We already extract 100 trillion BTUs, so it would only be an additional 120 or so trillion BTUs of thermal energy. Proceeding with the dairy industry. So we've got the dairy ring on the left representing all the actual cattle. Then we've also got a depiction of the dairy processing facilities actually making cheese and yogurt and all the other dairy products in state. And then this is a depiction of the population centers and the existing wastewater treatment plants, where essentially anaerobic digestion converts human or animal waste to biogas, which can then be used in combustion as well. So it's just kind of a show of three parallel figures, three parallel sources, you could say, of biomass energy that might be delivered to existing wastewater treatment centers to try to push them up to a critical level whereby they can generate at least maybe roughly half of the electricity needed to actually operate the facilities. So wastewater treatment plants are critical infrastructure. They're the unsung hero, you could say, of day-to-day life by preventing waterborne illnesses, the scourge of the 1700s, and also treating millions of gallons of water per day. And I think if anyone's from civil and environmental engineering, they fully understand the value of wastewater treatment centers. The larger ones that process more than 1 million gallons per day can actually close part of the loop in their operating energy requirements by using anaerobic digestion gas to run a combustion engine, provide electricity for the wastewater treatment center, and also capture heat, which can be used in some of the biodigestion processes. And so I kind of did an assessment of the 650 different wastewater treatment centers and the typical energy per gallon of material processed, and worked through some of the calculations. It turned out some of the, I think the 88 largest ones are able to, well, this is showing the energy demand for all 650 facilities, something of the order of 904 million megawatt hours, or 3.08 trillion BTUs. But the 88 largest wastewater treatment centers actually have anaerobic digesters and electricity generating systems where they can generate of the order of 438,000 megawatt hours of electricity. So this covers about half of the energy needs for all of the wastewater treatment centers in the state. And going back to the figure of the dairy ring and the dairy processing facilities, if some of those materials could be directed to some of the existing wastewater treatment centers, we might bump this number up to 600,000 and increase, you could say, the resilience of wastewater treatment centers in the state. Now moving on to biodiesel. Anyone from a farm family in the room? Good, yeah. Proud to be one, right? This actually may be kind of good news, at least if it's taken up at a state level. So currently there are 2 biodiesel plants in the state, and there are 9 corn ethanol plants in the state, producing of the order of 572 million gallons of ethanol per year. Well, I'm running low on time, so let me just buzz through these. This is the average corn and soybean yield for the year 2020. So 174 bushels per acre, 51 bushels per acre. I looked at agriculture census showing 10.1 million acres of farmland had been harvested in typical, fairly stable values over that time frame. And I was curious, if 1 bushel of corn can produce 2.7 gallons of ethanol, can all the corn in Wisconsin, if converted to ethanol, which is unrealistic, could it provide all the transportation energy needed within the state? And similarly, if every bushel of soybeans produces 1.4 gallons or 1.5 gallons of biodiesel, would that be sufficient to meet Rudolph Diesel's dream of farmers providing their own agricultural energy? So I went through, multiplied the yield by the fuel ratio, by the specific energy, determined the volume of fuel that could be produced and the thermal energy content that it would have. And it happens that if all 10.1 million acres of farmland in Wisconsin were planted with corn and all of that corn were converted to ethanol, then yes, we could provide all our gasoline needs with corn ethanol. In contrast, if all 10.1 million acres were planted with soybeans, it turns out we could also satisfy our agricultural needs and a portion, you could say, of our transportation needs. So this is the existing thermal energy content of ethanol and biodiesel in the state. And these are the existing demands. So 300 trillion BTUs of gasoline, 108 trillion BTUs of diesel for both transportation and agriculture sector. If it were all planted as corn converted to ethanol, we get about 400 trillion BTUs, which would exceed the necessary gasoline in this case. And if it were all planted with soybeans, we'd get 108 trillion, which would just meet the existing diesel needs. So currently all our diesel is, or a good chunk of it is bought from petroleum industries. But my proposal, at least given the current production methods, would be to use half the land for corn to ethanol, half for soy to biodiesel. I realize that's entirely unrealistic. The holy grail, so to speak, of ethanol production is herbaceous materials. That is to say, cellulosic ethanol, that is to use like corn stover and leaves and other materials like that, rather than valuable food products. Let me just kind of buzz through the rest of this, just so I don't keep anyone here too long. So From here, we see we need 1,224 trillion BTUs of energy to maintain the standard of living in the 4 economic sectors shown there. And so I did basically an audit, an energy balance of the Wisconsin energy infrastructure. Here's the 1,224 needed for end use for our current standard of living. 235 of that is accounted for in electricity. And so the remaining 988 trillion BTUs is needed for thermal energy, keeping our houses warm, our grocery stores, our industries, our schools, and all of that warm. I added in, so I separated this into thermal energy and electric energy. Again, the metric and US customary units. I added in the energy output of the one nuclear plant, the aspired value of all the hydroelectric plants, the existing 2.5 million plus the others. And then I partitioned the 64.8 trillion million megawatt hours of biomass energy in half. So 50% remains thermal, and then the other 50% becomes electric at 30% efficiency. Beyond that, I included the proposed ethanol and biodiesel supply at 250 trillion BTUs each. And basically what I ended up with was a deficit in the bottom, and essentially I proposed the remainder of that be covered by solar and wind. So that's kind of how I ended up with a total deficit of 228 million megawatt hours, which I evenly split between solar and wind. This is our energy per year, and the next steps are to put it on an energy per day basis. So I'll go through it real quick. Here's solar and wind capacity factors on the left, and on the right are capacity factors for hydroelectric and various forms of biomass. In order for you to obtain solar energy throughout the day, it takes fairly substantial battery storage right here. So all of these pink lines represent the batteries that would have to go along with photovoltaics in order to give them practical use. And these are just some figures showing how it is that it would exceed production. So I went through and I calculated, on the one hand, cell efficiency is of the order of 20%. And then all of the inverters, charge, discharge losses, and all of that can amount to of the order of 54%. So if we need 310,000 megawatt hours per day at 72% efficiency, the panels would have to collect 431,000 megawatt hours. And likewise, if we wanted to store that in batteries overnight, they'd actually have to collect 574,000 megawatt hours. So that's a pretty formidable lift in its own right. So I tried to size a photovoltaic system with storage based on the UW-Platteville 2.4 megawatt system over in Memorial Park, which costs $3.4 million. I used the land spacing ratio to get the total panel area, then the total land area that would be occupied, and then the total cost. $365 billion is a pretty steep price, I'll be the first to admit. And then taking in battery energy storage for photovoltaic and wind energy, I figured it would cost $350 for every kilowatt hour of electricity stored, multiplied by the 570,000 kilowatt hours gives us about $2 billion. And let's see, so that would give a total cost of the order of $871 billion for solar photovoltaic and storage to cover the deficiencies that will eventually be left by coal and natural gas. So based on the size and spacing ratios, if all of those were to put into one solar field, such as the one in Memorial Park, albeit scaled up to 570,000 megawatt hours, we'd need this much space for 570,000, this much for 310,000, plus $871 billion. Let me jump through for wind here as well. I do try to put it into context at the end. But here again, we've got 310,000 megawatt hours per day would take $120 billion. if it was used the instant it was generated. If we wanted to store it with 1 day storage, we'd have an additional battery cost of 231 billion, giving us a total of 450 billion. And then using the turbine spacing ratios, typical of the wind farm down in Lafayette County, we'd need wind farms about this big. So wind farms everywhere, right? So I don't mean to pour cold water on anyone's renewable energy ambitions. I'm still, on board with pursuing a more resilient energy infrastructure. But essentially what we'd have is if we were to take the cost of the solar and storage and then the wind and storage and divide it among the 5.8 million people over 25 years, solar alone would cost about $6,000 per person per year. Wind would cost an additional $3,100. But I want to point out, I modeled these on the worst case scenario. So this is modeled on the very low sunlight that we see in January, and this is modeled on the low wind that we see in July. So I didn't really talk about the capacity factors at that time. I realize I'm running late, so I'll just, I think, end with this discussion here. I pointed out in the Evers executive order that Wisconsin currently pays about $12 billion per year in fossil fuels alone. Who thinks that price is going to rise? Pretty much everyone, right? So the last little bit is projections of energy costs. So here we see stable wind energy cost from 2020 to 2050. I use that red line to project the data. Here we see solar photovoltaic costs from 2020 to 2050. They actually ended up much lower than the original projections right there, but I use that to estimate the projected cost as well. Likewise, battery storage, these are expected to experience a substantial decrease in cost. And then last of all, as all of you expected, fossil fuels, in this case, I just use oil as the reference, are projected to increase. It could be a very extreme increase, could be a fairly modest increase. I just went more or less with the reference increase shown there. So I projected it out for 25 years from 2025 to 2050, suggesting that we'd buy 1/25 of our solar and wind every year for the next 25 years until the full portfolio were built up. And I also show the projected cost of fossil fuels over that time frame, and you can see around 2043 or something like that, it'll cost more to keep firing the coal plants and keep firing the natural gas plants than it will to build solar and photovoltaic with energy storage. So I want to point out, on the one hand, this represents, the fossil fuel figure represents money that will go out of state no matter what. The green lines here represent solar and wind investments that may or may not go out of state. If Wisconsin had solar photovoltaic manufacturing like Minnesota does, they've got a big solar panel factory there, or if they built wind turbines in state, this money wouldn't even leave the state. And eventually you'd build up enough wind turbines that even though they've only got a 25-year lifespan, the money itself wouldn't lose out. So I asked myself, I'll ask you, after 25 years of investment, what would we have to show for it if we spent all our money on business as usual, fossil fuels? We'd have a lot of smoke, right? No one wants their money to go up in smoke. If instead we invested in solar panels and wind, then at the end of this time frame right here, we'd have 114 million megawatt hours of solar, and the oldest ones would only have about a year left on their life rating. Meanwhile, the newest ones would have an additional 25 years, right? And so you can see, at least in the long term, the more sensible investment would be solar and wind, but it's hard to convince individual people to pay $6,000, $8,000 a year for solar and wind, at least based on present prices. So we're a little past time. I don't want to delay anyone any longer. I may present a more full one on YouTube in the near future. So I think what I'll do is just end with questions. Anyone have any questions on what was covered? There's actually a whole lot more. but I try to pare it down to the best of my ability.
Sure.
Here we go.
With ethanol, did you factor, well, with like ethanol fuel, did you factor in the inefficiency? Like it's like 20% loss between growing the corn and making it into fuel.
Yeah, some of that was rolled into the, I think, 2.7 gallons per bushel or so.
Okay.
So, and then the other one, the energy actually used to plant and harvest it, at least the planting and harvesting would be accounted for in the agricultural energy balance. But I don't have the details of the operating energy needed to run a corn ethanol plant.
Okay.
The hope would be, of course, that some form of sustainable energy would be used in that respect, though. But that's a good question. Thank you. Yes.
With North Korea and Russia being a problem, now we have to worry about China, especially after this balloon that went over United States. And looking at what we have and what we don't have and stuff, I think we have to add that in there too.
That is a dilemma. On the one hand, U.S. was the first with nuclear weapons, and they probably have their own EMP satellites floating around. So we kind of have this dilemma of, you know, on the one hand, the U.S. is a leader in nuclear nonproliferation. On the other hand, the ones who've got comparable levels of that type of technology to Russia, they don't actually seem to threaten it the way that Russia does. And yeah, it's no surprise that so many other nations, not just North Korea and all of that, are interested in having the same ability, the ability to hang a sword of Damocles over America or any other adversary's head. So that's definitely the dilemma of the modern age. And frankly, it seems to be the story of humanity is a few tyrants, you know, get into positions of power and then kind of ruin it for everyone, right?
But I think with the way that balloon was going across the United States, I mean, they know it was over the nuclear plant and stuff, but I think if they would really look at it, it was over a lot of the power plants.
Yeah. And I'm not really sure what the intent of that was, because I thought satellites already had the ability to see most of that stuff anyways. But yeah, the 21st century is going to be a roller coaster.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping for the best and trying to advocate to at least have resilience locally. One of the manuscripts I read talked about the problem that there's not a lot of federal leadership in investing in energy resilience. They did provide Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but they commented that it's been incumbent on states to kind of take care of their own energy security. In fact, one of the experts said the situation is not unlike the rise of the walled cities that preceded the fall of Rome. Basically, Rome was so stretched out, they couldn't really provide for the security of the cities that were already within the empire. So those cities started building walls, hiring their own troops, and that's the analogy that the resilience experts had used to describe our situation.
So would you suggest that individual people and families get their own solar system or wind turbines?
I kind of would, yeah. And I know there's several students in the room who are learning the expertise on how to size those systems. I know I've got a few students in my classes who already have the ability to install them, size panels, inverters, battery packs. Yeah, I would say if you're, you know, an independent farm family with a big pole barn or something with a south-facing roof, by all means, try to make the investment and get as independent as possible. The challenge is wintertime, you know, on the one hand, heating the house, and on the other hand, getting enough sunlight to run all the electronics that you might use over the course of a day. But if you've got a decent amount of corn stover, that may be adaptable to some level of electricity generation, but it suffers from economies of scale. It's easier to generate for 10,000 people than for 10. You get more efficiency out of it. But those are all very good questions. Yes, Benjamin.
The solar and heating impact of that on biodiesel.
Yeah, wind is pretty non-invasive. You probably saw some wind turbines scattered around country fields and all of that. I think they sacrifice a little bit of the land, of the harvestable land, for the access road and then the actual wind turbine. Solar, in contrast, makes at least agricultural land unusable for planting and harvesting. The trade-off, at least, is I think we have, or it's a goal for the Platteville solar array, is to have grazing animals graze underneath it. So we've got a big dairy industry, and in theory, at least, if you could build them strong enough so that a cow doesn't rub against them and knock them over, you could still avail them of maybe 60, 70% of the grazing resources that they'd have had without the solar panels. But yeah, there are definitely trade-offs. And I, for one, wouldn't really want big wind turbines in my backyard if I had a nice piece of, rural country land and all of that. On the same note, if it gave me energy security, I might make a concession.
All right, any other questions? Any other questions? All right, so let's try at least one or two from the Zooms in here. Let's see, do we have any questions? Okay, so we have one here. One question: would the approximate 8,000 per person investment also be spread over 25 years, or how does that 8,000 work?
Yeah, that let me jump back to that if this proceeds. That was, taking the quotient then of these 871 billion, 450 billion, and adding them. So it looks more like 9,000 in present dollars at the slightly higher costs that wind and solar and battery storage currently have. But those are projected to decrease. So I haven't done the updated calculation. And as you all know, inflation throws a monkey wrench into any financial calculations. But at least the projections are that it would be a sensible investment, albeit we wouldn't really see the, parity of investments until the mid-2040s or so. So it's hard to persuade people to make an investment that they don't see a short return on. But nonetheless, given the limitations in fossil fuel supplies themselves, I guess I've got that on the next slide. At some point, whether it's 2040 or 2050 or so, these prices might get outrageous, with the exception of coal. Make sense? Yes. Yeah, I think that I think there's a recognition, at least, that at some point in the near future, we're going to have to deal with expensive petroleum and natural gas products. Coal's not really concerning, except for the fact that it releases soot, pollutes the air and all of that. But there's this recognition that if we don't kind of make the changes soon, we'll start feeling it more and more every year. It's kind of a carrot and stick situation. For quite a while, the incentives were the stick to try to nudge the electricity suppliers to invest in solar and wind. It's become something of a carrot in recent years because, trying to find my figures, because of the decrease in price. Now they're finding, especially this drop in the past decade or so, this has made solar a wise investment. The payback period is of the order of 5-7 years, depending on how sunny it is. Back here, it was of the order of 15-20 years. And so electric utilities weren't interested in investing in it.
All right, I'll do this. It's 6:10, so it's already over the 6 o'clock time that we prepared for, but it's, guys, all I want to say is that just a ton of information, right? Isn't it? So, well, please help me thank Dr. Zolper first. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so if you have questions, I believe Dr. Zolper will be here to answer your question, have more discussions, but feel free to leave. Thank you very much again for coming. So thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah. 2043, that's a time. Remember that. I like that.
Sorry
the
about
picture
that.
is beautiful. It's, you have that picture. It's great.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you much.
Thank you.
question, so solar panels look like about a 25-year lifespan. That's assuming like is that only like now when I say local, I'm gonna talk like nationally on a national scale. Is that resources we have available to us here with that cost?
Oh,
Manufactured in the U.S. Because I know I've been hearing reports recently of people who have been making investments and the solar panels that are coming out of China are only like about 10 to 15-year lifespans.
I think
So it's kind of, I was kind of curious, like what if where you were coming up with your number, because obviously that would change things quite a bit.
Yeah, I know there's a company in Minnesota. I forget the name of it. I can't remember the name offhand. But yeah, they from what I've read, most panels are more or less warranted to 90 to 95% of their performance. So if you buy it new and it's nameplate capacity of 100 watts or so, it'll be like 90 to 95 watts after 25 years. Okay. And even then, there's just kind of a gradual diminishment.
Yeah.
But it's just not quite at the nameplate that
okay.
has been projected.
I was just curious. I know because I was like causing some people to be up in arms about, oh, we're backtracking in solar. It's getting worse or something. And I'm just like, well, I don't know how that, it's not necessarily like apples to apples, but it's different manufacturers. So it's.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes you get what you paid for. Exactly. It helps to do the research up front.
That's kind of why I was curious if like that 25-year that was like based off of things that would honestly be cheaper to get those ones here anyways, manufactured on such a large scale.
Yeah, and the hope would be that eventually once you saturated your utility market, that you'd have recycling facilities and that could further lower the cost because you don't have to get all the rare earth elements needed to induce the photovoltaic effect. But yeah, my hope would be that Wisconsin, could recognize that if they built solar and wind industries, they wouldn't be sending all that money out of state.
I think is there a wind manufacturing facility in the state? I feel like
I don't think there is, but they've got the ability. I mean, they build big ships, 1,000-foot Lakers over on Lake Michigan, Marinette Marine.